So the literature is an article very recent from 2019 with the title Preferences, Neither Behavioral nor Mental in the journal Economics and Philosophy, volume 35. Francesco Guala is a professor of political economy in the Department of Philosophy of the University of Milan in Italy, and he describes himself as a philosopher and experimental economist. His most important publications, as far as I can see, is first the book The Methodology of Experimental Economics that appeared with Cambridge in 25, and his latest book is Understanding Institutions, The Science and Philosophy of Living Together, that has appeared with Princeton University Press. All right. Now, Guala asked the question that seems important for an understanding of preferences. What are preferences? He doesn't ask it in the sense that he gives an answer like the one Horstman gives by saying, yes, it's comparative evaluations, total, subjective, etc. But he rather asks the question, which seems to be important also, what sort of thing are preferences? Now, the most common possibilities that you find in the literature, if people ask this question at all, that preferences are behavioral regularities, namely choices. Now, that seems to be, and seemed to me, and has seemed to me always very strange, because a preferences may give rise to choices, but it certainly isn't identical with a choice. So that seems to me very strange, but some neoclassical economists describe it that way. An alternative that is pretty close to this one is that preferences are revealed by choices. Now we saw that this revelation of preferences by choices has the difficulty of the belief component of choices. As soon as there is a belief component that is mistaken, then the choices do not reveal the preferences themselves. The second possibility that has been given up in the neoclassical economics after the Second World War is that preferences are mental states. There are certain states that the mind can be in, like being in the states of having a wish, or thinking 2 times 2 is 5, or experiencing heat. So it's a state that the mind has, and if you describe preferences as they are used in economics in this way, then you open the door to psychology and neuroscience. Now, this is something what is typically rejected by neoclassical economists, but not by behavioral economists. It is rejected especially in the second phase of the neoclassical economics, beginning roughly after the Second World War, in which all the bridges to psychology or sociology, for that matter, have been cut. Economics explains choice behavior on the basis of given preferences, but does not explain preferences. This is the job that economics usually outsources to psychology and says it's not the business of neoclassical economics. Of course, the behavioral economists, they disagree, and they see preferences really as something that can be subjected to a further, typically psychological analysis. And if you go to the neuroeconomists, they say preferences are the product of some neuronal activity, so they can be subjected to a neuroeconomic analysis. So about this nature of preferences, there is this controversy between the neoclassicists on the one hand and the behavioral and neuroeconomists on the other. Now, Guala's point is that he suggests that preferences are dispositions to choices. Now, then the question is, of course, what are, for instance, dispositions? And here is the standard example from the philosophy of science. Solubility in water is a disposition of certain kinds of materials, of sugar, for instance. So something that's soluble in water will, when put into water, dissolve. You can only observe this solubility in water if you prepare the respective conditions, namely, if you put your piece of sugar into water, and only then it dissolves. Or, to take another example, mortality is also a disposition. It's, of course, a property of, for instance, human beings or of other biological entities. And that means a mortal entity will, under certain circumstances, die. So there is a disposition, meaning that given certain conditions, something that is not manifest, but rather latent, becomes manifest because of the conditions that bring this entity to reveal its dispositions or make them active. Now, if you apply this idea to the question of choices, then you can argue analogously, someone having certain preferences will, given appropriate circumstances, choose according to these preferences. So the preferences are, to put it in another way, the potential of making certain choices. And that sort of potential has, both in everyday language and in more technical language of philosophy of science, this name disposition. Now, it seems to me a great advantage of this view that preferences as dispositions are neutral with respect to the controversy about the nature of preferences between the neoclassical and the behavioral economists' view. The neoclassicists see them rather as a sort of mathematical construction in order then to derive choices, whereas the behavioral economists and also the neuroeconomists see them as something psychological or neural that can be investigated by empirical methods. The view that preferences are dispositions is completely neutral with respect to this controversy. So it seems to be a concept about which the different camps within economics could agree. Now, it's very interesting that the idea of preferences as dispositions, as best conceptualized as dispositioned, has been absent in economics until Guala's article. And for me, this was coming from this tradition of philosophy of science. Dispositions have been a standard term and a standard means of analysis, but no economists I ever asked knew about it. And I talked with many economists about it and philosophers of economics, but this idea seemed to have been completely absent until Guala's article, and therefore I welcomed Guala's article quite a bit. There's a large literature on dispositions in philosophy because dispositions play a fundamental role in the natural sciences. Many of the properties we talk about in the natural sciences are in fact dispositions. So, for instance, if you talk about the electrical charge of a particle, then you cannot, by just observing the particle by itself, observe its electrical charge. That electrical charge comes to the fore if you put the particle in an electrical field. And then the particle will experience a force, and mostly then a movement, a motion that is caused by the force. And that means then that the charge is a certain disposition for experiencing forces with ensuing motions. Many other concepts in physics are also dispositions in this sense, and it turned out that it's very difficult to define a disposition in terms of the effects it has. So it is possible to describe the effects of a disposition, but it's a different thing that to define them in terms of the effect. So one has to be careful. It's easy to describe the effects of a disposition, but when it comes to a formal definition, in which you usually have to give sufficient and necessary conditions for the presence of that quality or property, then it turned out that this is much more difficult than philosophers had anticipated. Now, we don't have to worry about that, but it may show that what has been tried in neoclassical economics to define choices, or to define, dispositions, preferences in terms of choices, that this turned out to be quite hard. And if we take the position that preferences are dispositions, namely to choose in a given situation in a certain way, then it's not a surprise that it will be difficult to define dispositions in terms of choices. Now, if you became interested now in the idea what dispositions are, I can recommend, again from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the article by Choi and Farah, Dispositions. There you find probably more than you are interested in, but it brings to your consciousness this long discussion about dispositions in the philosophy of science.